So TSPN would like to acknowledge that we're hosting this event on the traditional lands of many Indigenous nations. The Greater Toronto Area is the traditional territory of nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe, Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. And this land is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, it's home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, and we encourage each of you to learn more about the Indigenous nations on which lands you currently work and live. We also would like to remind everyone that we have a strict no harassment policy at our events. So for anyone who is not familiar yet with TSPN, we are a student-run science policy group based out of the University of Toronto. TSPN aims to provide a platform for students as well as postdoctoral researchers to learn more about and engage in science policy. TSPN is open to all disciplines and inclusive of all areas of research. And since July 2018, we've organized a variety of events engaging hundreds of individuals through science advocacy, workshops like the one today, public panels, written pieces, and more. And we work with the community to advocate for evidence-based policy and promote discussion on the science behind key policies. So this workshop series is a Science Policy 101 series, and it's designed to teach you about the basics of science policy and also connect you with experts engaged in that space. So to start off, we're going to look at these initial questions, starting with what is science policy? The term science policy can be used to define different things. It can be used to describe the way science is governed and allocated resources. It can also be used to describe how policy is formed based on evidence from scientific research. And in either case, this interface between science and policy is incredibly important and really has a significant impact on the way society functions. We're going to try to explain this a little bit more by touching on the second point here, which is where does science policy fit in with other forms of science translation, or in other words, other ways of moving from scientific research to its practical applications. So we've developed a map to help make sense of all of the different ways that this can occur. And as we go through the next section, you can be thinking about this last question here, which is where do you fit into that space of science translation or science policy, and where do your skills and interests lie? So we're going to start off with this map that we at TSPN built to help conceptualize how science policy fits into the world of science translation. So science translation is this overall umbrella term for this pathway going from generating scientific knowledge, scientific research, to the ways in which that knowledge is used, which is its implementation. And as you might imagine, this can occur via various paths. So a few of the main ways that this translation occurs are shown here. So scientific research is used to build the scientific body of knowledge, to increase the public's knowledge, to create new technologies, and to create policy. And at the top, we have this scientific research being communicated to the scientific community to contribute to the scientific body of knowledge. And the direct implementation of this can happen, for example, if we think about examples from COVID, it might be clinicians using the continuously updated research on COVID to help treat their patients. And so many of you are in research-based programs and likely have experience with these pathways of translation to the scientific community, which can include publications in scientific journals, science dissemination, which includes conferences and presentations, and science education, including the courses that many of you took in undergrad and in graduate school, as well as your research training in the lab. But moving down to the pathway of translating research to the public, this can be translated to the public either as information or as products and services. So think about like new technologies that utilize the scientific knowledge. So to look at the first blue part, the information, this includes processes that you would normally think of as falling into the category of science communication. So including science journalism, like the news, documentaries, books, and podcasts. There's science outreach, which is promoting public awareness of science. And finally, science education. So where we're thinking about educating the public, increasing science literacy. And the direct implementation of this, again, to take a COVID example, might be how at the start of the pandemic, many people were disinfecting their groceries because we weren't sure how COVID was transmitted. But after finding more information about the virus and its transmission, we changed our behavior and stopped doing that. So moving down further, products and services are another way that the public can use scientific research. This can involve product development using the latest scientific knowledge to design new products, or technology transfer where intellectual property is transferred usually from the government to industry for the purpose of creating useful products. And an example, again, from COVID, from this pathway, would be the COVID rapid antigen tests. So they were developed based on new research, and then they were technology used every day by people to help manage the pandemic. And then this last line here is the science being communicated to policymakers to help develop policy. So the last one on the bottom. The processes we have included here are science advice and science advocacy. Science advice occurs when policymakers seek out information from advisors who have more knowledge about the science relevant to policies that they're writing or decisions that they're making. Whereas science advocacy describes the push, often by scientists or by the public, for the increased use of evidence in policymaking. And this whole pathway we like to call science for policy, and it's going to be the main focus of today's workshop. An example of direct implementation resulting from this pathway could be something like the mask mandates that were put in place based on evidence of COVID transmission. Science advisors communicated the science behind how COVID spreads and how masks work to policymakers to help them write policies that would work. So very importantly, all of these four components of knowledge translation actually loop back to inform which research is conducted next. And what is known scientifically informs the next questions that can be asked. What the public is interested in also contributes to what is studied, and the technology and tools that are available also define what research can be done. And this particular looping back pathway here down at the bottom, where policy informs what scientific research is done, as much as how research informs how policy, is particularly of interest to us since we're looking at the science policy interface. And we call this pathway policy for science, and it will be the focus of our workshop next week. So within the policy for science pathway, policy can be directed towards the research or the researchers, but in any case, it greatly influences the type, amount, and quality of scientific research that's conducted. So here are these two key science policy interface pathways isolated. And each of these pathways is going to be the focus of one of our workshops in the Research at Work series. So we're starting today with workshop 1, Science for Policy, where we'll explore how scientific research is implemented through policy. And then in our second workshop next week, we'll focus on the policy for science pathway, which will examine how policies govern which scientific research is conducted. So we're very pleased today to have Dr. Jeff Kinder joining us as our expert speaker. Dr. Jeff Kinder has 30 years experience in government science, technology, and innovation policy. His US experience includes the National Science Foundation, National Academies, and Naval Research Lab. In Canada, Jeff has worked at Industry Canada, Natural Resources Canada, and the Council of Science and Technology Advisors. From 2015 to 2017, he led the Federal Science and Technology Secretariat, supporting the Minister of Science and Deputy Minister Champion for Science. And from 2017 to 2022, he led the Science and Innovation Practice at the Institute on Governance. At U Ottawa, Jeff is the inaugural executive in residence at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, and adjunct at the Telfer School of Management. He's a project director at Council of Canadian Academies, directing assessments on international partnerships and quantum technologies. Jeff is a member of the Canadian Science Policy Centre Board and the High Bar Research Alliance Governing Council. A recovering physicist, he holds a PhD in public policy and a master's in science, technology, and public policy. Thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Kinder, and I'm going to give you the floor to share your experiences in the science policy space.
Okay.
Set of slides.
Excellent. Thank you, Bren. That was a very nice introduction. Thank you. And I really like the pathways of science translation that you showed. I think that's a very helpful overview of the various aspects of science policy. And of course, today I'm going to focus on that one science for policy strand primarily, but happy to talk about other strands as well. First, let me just say that I'm joining you all today from Ottawa, so joining from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. Okay, I do have some slides I'm going to move through fairly quickly, and then we'll definitely reserve some time for questions and comments, and then we'll get into the case study, as Bryn said, in the second half of the session. But let me just start with a bit of a presentation just to kind of set the stage on what this whole area of science policy is all about, and introduce some of the concepts behind the science for policy strand. Let's go to the next slide. So before I get into kind of definitions and concepts, I'd like to start with just why, step back a minute and just say, why do we even care about science policy? Why is it something that governments, pay attention to? And of course, there are many rationales, many reasons for it. One that you will most often hear, particularly from the political level, is the economic rationale. And this is the idea that science and technology lead to innovation, which then leads to greater productivity and competitiveness in the private sector, and on up this sort of stairway to heaven to a better quality of life. And so governments support science and technological research primarily for this sort of innovation and economic rationale. But it's not, that's not the whole story. If we go to the next slide, we can see that there are other reasons. And in fact, this is from a declaration on public sector innovation from a few years ago that explicitly made the point that innovation does more than just drive strong economic growth. It has the potential to solve the big challenges that we face as Canadians. So this introduces then a second major rationale for science policy, which is this idea of, grand challenges that society faces. Science and technology are important inputs to addressing those. Next slide, please. So then if we look at some of the data from public opinion surveys, this is from 3M from a couple of years ago, the list of issues that the public looks to science to help solve, not surprisingly, healthcare and climate change are at the top of those lists. Unfortunately for Mr. Trump, border security is at the bottom, but nonetheless, the whole idea is that there's a wide range of public policy challenges that science and research can help address, and the public does see that as an important element of science policy. Next slide, please. There are also two other major rationales for science policy. One is just a fiscal rationale, which is to say that we spend a lot of money on scientific research and innovation, and so it makes sense for the government then to have a strategy or a policy that helps guide those investments. These numbers may not be completely up to date, but order of magnitude, as a country, we spend $36 billion a year on research and development. The federal government alone spends about $14 billion a year on science and technology. Those two are not directly comparable because there is a distinction between S&T and R&D, but I don't really need to go into that. Just generally speaking, we're spending, a fair bit of money. About 4% of the federal budget each year goes into science and technology, and that goes to not only the granting councils and out to universities, but it also pays for the research that's done in-house within government, in government labs, and it also supports some research in the private sector. So, so for all of those reasons, it makes sense to have a science policy. And finally, there's a cultural aspect to it, which is just the idea that we invest in science as a society because we want to advance our understanding of our place in the universe. We want to combat ignorance and superstition. And there's even a sort of aesthetic aspect to it, that we draw from science new ideas, new concepts, new metaphors, even art. And so while this is not usually the rationale that politicians will put forward in terms of why we're spending that $14 billion a year at the federal level, they usually rely on the economic innovation argument. Nonetheless, as a advanced society, it makes sense to think about the cultural aspects of science as well. Next slide, please. So with that as just kind of a background in terms of why we even pay attention to science policy, I then want to drill down into this idea of the interface between science and policy and the integration of science and policy. As we know, when the current government came in 2015, they raised the profile of science. They sent very positive signals from the highest levels of government that science is important. Trudeau said that scientific knowledge should inform decision making. So these were all important signals. Having said that, if we go to the next slide, I think it's important to remember always that despite what a government might say in terms of how much it values evidence-based decision-making or evidence-informed decision-making, we can remember what the famous economist John Maynard Keynes once said, which is that there's nothing a government hates more than to be well informed, because it makes the process of arriving at decisions that much more complicated and difficult. So a government can be, for evidence and for the integration of science and policy until it's not. And I think that's true of any government, of whatever political stripe they are. And so while this government has sent a lot of clear signals that science is important, it's always something that's contingent on the context and the decision that's before them on any given day. So let's go to the next slide. So let's drill down a little bit then in terms of what is exactly science policy, and Bryn in her introductory remarks has already alluded to this distinction that I'm going to draw. This is the distinction that actually dates back 60 years to some of the early scholarship on science policy, and it's the idea that science policy has what I like to call kind of two sides to the coin. It has this policy for science piece and then the science for policy piece. So what is that all about? So the policy for science side is a bit more straightforward in the sense that it is like any other sort of public policy area. It's the idea that science policy is concerned with those policies or those strategies, budgets, management, support of this particular policy field of scientific research. So policy for science is about how do we support Canada's scientific enterprise, including STEM education and training, including funding of research, including all the values around that. And like it says here, in this way, science policy is not really any different than any other public policy field. What makes science policy somewhat unique, I would say, is that there's this other side of the coin, which is science for policy. And that's the idea of science produces insights and data and knowledge and leads to new technologies and methods that can be used across a wide range of other public policy fields. And so science for policy is understanding that side of the coin. Now, Bryn, I think, made a very useful distinction between science advice and science advocacy. I'm happy to have that be part of the discussion. I'm going to focus primarily on the science advice substrand, I guess. Science advocacy is also extremely important. And in fact, many of you will know that 10 years ago or so, there was the Death of Evidence March on Parliament Hill, which then I think was instrumental in getting the scientific community rallied to press for greater support for science in government, and that then led to, I think, a higher profile for science during the 2015 campaign. But I'm not going to spend a lot of time on advocacy. I'm going to speak more to the science advice aspect. So next slide, please. Now, because this distinction is so fundamental to science policy, I'm going to drill down a little bit more on these two sides just for a minute before we focus more exclusively on science for policy. So when we talk about policy for science, what kinds of questions are we looking at or thinking about? So what needs do we have as Canadians or as a global society that STI can help address? How do we resource those? What personnel are needed? Do we need to increase the graduate student stipend, for example? What are the institutional arrangements that are most conducive to advancing science and technology? Obviously, we have a system that has multiple components to it. University and college sector is a vital part of developing new knowledge and conveying that to the next generation. We also have a lot of research being done by private sector companies. We also have a lot of government labs that do a lot of research. And increasingly, there's collaboration, there's networks, there's how do we bring in international players. So lots of different possible arrangements for the system. And policy for science spends a lot of time thinking that through. And last but not least, what values should guide the profession? So we can think of things like policies around use of human subjects in research or animals in research. We can think about the EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, which you'll hear from next week from Imogen about. So all of those would also come in under this broad heading of policy for science. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, on the flip side, on the science for policy side, if you're working more in that area, some of the questions that you might grapple with would be, how can the results of science inform policy decisions? What should count as evidence? So, for example, one of the key challenges that we're grappling with at this point is the introduction of indigenous traditional knowledge and trying to understand how do we interweave these different ways of knowing. It's not just the knowledge, though, and the data, but it's also the methods. So we can think of risk analysis, for example, which initially came out of the technical disciplines, but is now used quite broadly across government in their policy decision making. So we've adapted a method from science and technology to a broader use to inform policy processes. And then science for policy also gets into very definitely into the whole area of science advice. What's the appropriate relationship between advisors and decision makers? So this government sort of reinstituted the chief science advisor role position. Dr. Mona Niemer is in that role. And there are a whole range of questions around how do you properly structure that kind of office or that function? Does the advisor only provide advice? Can they make decisions? What's the role of a chief science advisor in championing the scientific community? Is that is that sort of in bounds or out of bounds? And what are those other mechanisms that are most effective for helping to feed science advice into the decision-making process? So these are the types of questions you would be dealing with if you're sort of working more on the science for policy side of the coin. But having said that, we don't want to have too much of a distinction between these two aspects, because in fact, ideally, we're in a situation where they're sort of mutually reinforcing one another, so that the policy for science considerations and issues are helping to drive the science for policy considerations and issues, and vice versa. Like, it's a nice virtuous circle of policy for science supporting science for policy and vice versa. Next slide, please. So now, having kind of set that as the stage in terms of the policies for science and science for policy, I am going to now focus primarily on the science for policy side, and then as you heard, next week you'll get exposed a little bit more to the policy for science side. So let's start with the sort of standard model, if you will, in terms of how this interface works between science and policy. So we know there's a science community, we know that there's a policy community. Much of what they do within each of those communities has nothing to do with the other, but there is obviously a point of interface or a point of overlap between these two worlds. And unfortunately, historically, that interface has felt somewhat like kind of like the Berlin Wall, where you've got the two sides, east and west, coming together, but at that interface there is a barrier that's very hard to overcome. In fact, traditionally the sense was that one side was kind of lobbing hand grenades over the wall at the other side without a lot of integration, without a good, strong relationship between these two communities. So if that's the standard model, we obviously want to move beyond that to a more effective model. So let's go to the next slide. Basically, we want to get to this idea where we've broken down the barrier between the two communities, and that we have more people who are actually able to have a foot in both camps, who understand science, who understand policy, and can work as knowledge brokers between those two communities. Next slide. So, key messages. If you take nothing else away from this talk, these three things I want to stress. First of all, if we're going to be successful at integrating these two communities, both sides need to take ownership. The onus of responsibility needs to be on both sides. It can't be, and I've heard this throughout my career, the science side will say, oh, we'd be happy to, provide evidence for policy, but, it's up to the policy side to kind of signal clearly what they need and come ask us for our advice. The policy side, similarly will say, yeah, sure, we'd love to integrate scientific evidence, but those scientists, they can't speak in plain language. We can't, understand what they're talking about. And so they put the onus on the scientific side to solve this issue. As long as we're kind of in that scenario, this is never going to work. We need both sides to work together. The arrow has to be a double, two-headed arrow, with both sides trying to build a bridge to cross the divide between these two communities. And the other key thing that I think is a key message is that if this is going to work, we can't just have the integration occur at the time a decision is needed. That's too late usually. I mean, it's better than nothing, but ideally, the more successful integration occurs when you have early and ongoing interactions between the two communities. And that leads then to the obvious third key message, which is that relationships are key. So building relationships between science and policy is as important as, getting the best advice or evidence into policy at the right moment. Let's go to the next slide. So I've already talked about these two communities or two worlds or two cultures. So let's unpack that a little bit. So this is a picture of C.P. Snow up in the upper right corner. He was a British civil servant who gave a famous lecture about 60 years ago called The Two Cultures. And I've adopted that language to help explore why it's difficult to integrate these two cultures, science and policy. There are clear barriers that we need to recognize and work to overcome. Biggest one being the different time horizons. In science, we're often, working for months, years, sometimes even decades on a particular research question. Policy, this times, the cycles are much shorter. At most, you've got kind of the 4 years of a mandate of a government, but even, more often decision cycles are being made, weeks, days, sometimes hours. So there's a basic mismatch in terms of the provision of scientific evidence and its need to inform policy decisions. And that's a big barrier. I won't go through all of these in detail, but some of the other ones around language and lexicon. And again, I've kind of already alluded to this idea that, in science, we try to speak in very, precise language. We have our jargon, but also, the policy world, it prefers a little bit more flexibility, wants a little wiggle room. But it also has a jargon that can be difficult for the scientific side to understand. So both sides need to come to each other, speaking in plain language. And this is challenging. Uncertainty, I mean, obviously in science, we're working in uncertainty all the time. We understand, confidence intervals and standard deviations and all of that. The policy world has less comfort with uncertainty. And so that can be a barrier. I'll skip down here. Transparency is another one, like in at least in the academic world, where the norm is to put as much of the science out in the literature, openly available, and that's been enhanced in recent years with the whole open science movement. But even before that, I mean, the general notion was you publish your science, and so therefore it's out there. In the policy world, as much as we talk about openness and transparency, there is, I think, a general sense that most decision making, at least at the highest level, is still a closed process. You can think of, for example, cabinet at the federal level. Cabinet meetings are closed. We don't really even know what the agendas are or what's being said there, and so it's difficult to know how much the scientific evidence was informing decisions being made at that table, for example. And then just in terms of location as well, so there can be a geographical barrier in the sense that, at least within government, you've got science being done in the regions. So, government labs and of course, universities are spread throughout the country and indeed the world. I mean, Canada only produces about less than 4% of all the journal publications in the world. So, 96% of the world's science is coming from elsewhere. Whereas policy is very much sort of a headquarters function centered in Ottawa. And so even when there's a will to work with the other side, it can be difficult to just link up, right? Because we're in different locations. So let's go to the next slide. So these are all potential barriers to the integration of science and policy, but they can also provide excuses for either side to just say, this is going to be too hard, we're not going to do this. That is not my message. My message is, let's recognize that there are some barriers to integration, but we can work on those and overcome those. So let's just quickly then think about, how does this actually work? So we'll start with a very simplistic perspective, and that's the idea that science is kind of this beacon of truth. It puts the scientific evidence out there for anyone to use as they want, and so therefore they're really, from this very simplistic perspective, there should be no problem with integrating science and policy because the science is out there. It doesn't really work that way, because the policy side, even if they had the time to read journal articles, they're typically not going to understand most of it, again, because of the scientific jargon and the highly specialized aspect of scientific publications. So that very basic way of thinking about this integration problem doesn't work. Let's go to the next way of thinking about it, and that is to put the decision maker at the center of the universe. And the idea is that, well, okay, if science can just kind of get the ear of the minister or the prime minister or the decision maker, the city councilor, depending on what level we're talking about, as long as science can feed into that decision maker, then the evidence will help drive what that policy is. Now, this is a bit more sophisticated than the previous way we were thinking about it, but it's still insufficient. And yet, sometimes when we use language like evidence-based decision-making, it does seem that we're kind of thinking like, yeah, as long as if we can get the evidence to the decision maker, then the decision will be based on the evidence. And again, I think this is overly simplistic for a couple reasons. Let's go to the next slide. For one thing, science doesn't speak with one voice, and particularly when you're dealing with these very complicated public policy challenges that we're grappling with today, we need inputs from a lot of different disciplines, and those different schools of thought or different disciplines will provide input that doesn't necessarily always agree. So that is challenging for the decision maker to deal with. Next slide. But even more importantly, of course, the decision maker is not only considering science. There is a whole wide range of considerations, whether it be political, economic, legal, depending on the issue. It could have diplomatic aspects to it, social, cultural, and many, many others. And so the idea, that science is going to necessarily drive any decision is just, I think, not a helpful way of thinking about this. We need to understand that political decision makers have a whole wide range of things to consider. And it goes even beyond this. Next slide, because rarely these days would we actually have only a single decision maker. I mean, I just mentioned cabinet. That's an example where you've got multiple ministers coming together with the prime minister to try to make decisions on behalf of Canadians. So you've got multiple decision makers, and I don't know that they all come to a decision process, with this kind of laundry list of, okay, have I considered the political? Have I considered the economic? Have I considered the scientific inputs? Rather, if you go to the next slide, they tend to come at a decision-making process with different lenses or different preferences. And so in this very much more complicated and messy system, you only can hope that there's somebody at the table who's bringing that scientific perspective, because there's no guarantee that the other decision makers are paying attention to that as an input. So now we've gone from a very sort of neat and tidy linear process of science to the decision maker, therefore driving the policy, to a much messier system. And I think this reflects reality, unfortunately. So let's go to the next slide. All is not lost, but if we then land on this perspective of how the integration might work, we focus on issues. And if you talk to policy people, they do tend to emphasize that the system is very much issue driven. So an issue arises, it comes into the system, and then there are these various dimensions. And this is obviously drawing on the idea of light coming into a prism, and then depending on the characteristics of the prism, you'll get the bending of light out the other side. Well, here the idea is an issue comes into the system, and then depending on the relative inputs or influence of ideas, information, interests, individuals, institutions, instruments, all of those things will help shape what comes out the other side. You still have in the interior of the prism here, you have those bubbles, which are all those various multiple decision makers still. So it's a very complex system. And what should strike you is that nowhere on this slide is science explicitly identified. So the question then is, well, wait a minute, where's science? Like, how does science help input or influence the decision? And I think that's right. I think we need to consider that the system works in a way that does not necessarily explicitly consider the science. And so I would say that the scientific community, the onus on their side is to then think about, okay, how can my science, if this is the system that works, or if this is the way that decisions are made, how can my science influence by providing new ideas or providing new information? Can we have new technological solutions that provide new instruments to decision makers? Can we work through institutions or individuals, or can we understand the various interests that are at play and see how we can align with those to help influence the system towards the impacts or towards the policy decision that we think the science suggests we should achieve. So, I mean, the idea then is science is not an explicit consideration, but it doesn't mean that science can't still influence the system. We just have to be a bit more sophisticated and nuanced about how that actually plays out. Next slide. Yeah, I think that's it. So let me stop there and open the table for a couple minutes of questions or comments, and then we'll get into the case study. The floor is yours. What would you like to ask or comment on about the integration of science and policy?
It looks like there's a few questions in the chat.
Okay.
Or at least one very long question.
Okay, let me see if I can get the gist of it. So we talk about the two cultures of science and policy and a barrier akin to the Berlin Wall separating them. What do you think about how geography departments function at universities for bridging the divide? A bit of interest. Let's see. Yeah, well, so I think, well, geography, all disciplines, I think, have a part to play in this broader conversation around science for policy, but geography can help, absolutely. Partly, the whole rise of geographical information systems and the way of visualizing data has been a huge boon to influencing decision making, because frankly, as I kind of indicated, decision makers have no time to read, journal articles or books, or so the notion that, okay, we're putting the evidence out there and they can just pick it up and use it, like that just doesn't work. So to the extent that we can create visualizations, infographics, anything that helps, boil down the very complicated evidence into things that are easy for decision makers to pick up. I would add as well anecdotes, storytelling. Like in science, we tend to sort of look down our noses at anecdotal evidence, right? Because it's anecdotal, it's not rigorous, it's not the high quality rigorous data that that we value in science. And yet for a decision maker, being able to frame an issue and explain it to the public in ways that everyone can understand is hugely helpful. So as scientists, we need to kind of step out of our expertise and think about, okay, how do I explain this, fairly, complex concept to someone who, has a high school level education or even less. In fact, journalists I think are trained to think about kind of 8th grade level literacy levels. So as scientists, obviously, we're rewarded for being highly specialized and being very rigorous, but in intersecting with the policy world, we need to kind of step back from that and say, okay, how do I explain this in a way that will be helpful? Other questions or comments?
There's another one in the chat there, and then maybe if we can move on to the case study, and then I don't know, Dr. Kinder, if you're available to stay for a few minutes after.
I can.
People can still ask questions at that point.
Absolutely, that sounds good.
Okay.
So what's the next question? Okay. So what is the first step as an individual scientist or as part of an or organization not directly affiliated with the government to be able to put your voice on the map of policymaking? Excellent question. So there are many avenues. There's no sort of silver bullet or one answer here. I mean, things like what we're doing now, interacting with your member of parliament, inviting them to your lab, writing. Whenever you write a scientific article, can you also write a plain language abstract and convert that into like a one-page policy brief to help decision makers understand what might be the policy implications of the research you're doing? Can you write op-eds for your local newspaper? Can you help go into high schools and help talk about your research? All of these things ultimately, I mean, they may not directly influence the policy world, but they're a part of broadening what it means to be a researcher and thinking about how to best communicate your evidence to a policy audience. So those are just some of the many ways that you can do that. Again, there's no sort of necessary first step, but I would just say just start trying to do some of those things that will help you understand how to communicate to a policy world. Okay, given the time, maybe we should move into the case study. So we had sent out a two-page case study in advance called Tangeria. Now, this is a fictionalized case study that I've adopted from a library of case studies that's prepared by INGSA, which is the International Network on Government Science Advice. And I hope you had a chance to have a look at that. It's a fairly rich case study in the sense of there are lots of stakeholders. In fact, I don't know if you had a sense of how many, but when I teach this case study, one of the first steps we do is to say, okay, excuse me, who are the stakeholders that you can identify in this two-page case study? And people will often say, oh, maybe there's like 6 or 8. There are actually over 25 potential stakeholders in this case study. Now, that's kind of everybody, but then a key first step when you're dealing with integrating science and policy is to map those stakeholders and to understand, which ones are the ones that are most important to the issue at hand. So I want to just open the floor and give people a chance to say, based on your reading of the case study, how would you frame the issue? Like, what is the issue? How do you boil that down to one sentence? Because again, public policy challenges are highly complex, but one of the key functions of science advisors is to help boil that down into like 1 or 2 sentences that really captures what the crux of the issue is. So I want to open the floor and give anyone who wants to a chance to say, what's your framing of the issue? How would you characterize what the issue is? And then what would your advice to, say, the president of Tangeria be about that issue? So let me just open the floor and see what brave soul out there wants to take a crack at this. And again, this is safe space. We're just here to help learning, and so feel free to take a crack at it. Any volunteers on characterizing what the issue is that faces the president of Tangeria? And I'm not able to see all of the people, so if someone's got their hand up, let me know. Natasha, please jump in.
All right, I'll give it a shot.
Excellent.
So the main concerns are, I guess, that there are safety concerns relating to this gene-edited maize strain. That there's like lots of rising pressure from rural and agricultural workers and voter base for financial reasons, and that these pesticides might be carcinogens, and that's still really debated. And also that there are these research stakeholders that may have some potentially some biases in themselves, because they are also funded by some lobbying parties. So those are the main issues that I saw.
Absolutely. And well done. I mean, these are some of the many aspects of the case study or of the issue. So let me give you some feedback again in the spirit of learning. So we use terms like maze, carcinogenic. These are terms that policymakers may not be familiar with. So in North America, we typically would say corn, even though there may be a technical difference between maize and corn. Carcinogenic, probably most people know that term at this point, but still, why not just say, cancer causing? Also, if you notice, and this is where we kind of trip people up with the case study, there is a footnote in the case study that suggests that the one scientist or the one study that found a possible link to cancer, that study had actually been retracted. And so, in thinking about how you would present this to a decision maker, particularly at the level of president of the country of Tangeria, you wouldn't want to introduce noise into the system. You wouldn't want to introduce things that aren't very clearly relevant to the issue at hand. And so, given that cancer is something that can be very inflammatory in terms of, okay, I'm going to focus on this now because it may be causing cancer. If in fact the scientific community, the consensus is actually that not well supported, maybe you don't introduce that, at least in the opening, description of what the issue is. That can be, a detail that you get into, down the road as you're having more of a discussion about the issue. But when you're sort of leading off with, okay, here's the issue, you want to keep it as squarely focused on what the science is saying, that can be defended with evidence. So, but generally speaking, yeah, I thought you did a great job of capturing some of the the complexities and nuances of the issue. So, anyone else want to take a stab at it? I mean, it's such a rich case study that you can actually there's actually not one issue here. There's many issues, so you can actually take different angles on what the issue is. Emma, please jump in.
I can sort of give it a quick stab as well.
Yeah.
So to boil it down into like just one sentence, I would say the issue would be to determine whether the government's sort of current policies on gene editing techniques sort of, or whether there should sort of be changes to the current policies on gene editing techniques in order to allow this TAACI to be allowed to conduct their research on this edited corn.
Yep. No, absolutely, and that's a nice way of putting it, so that you immediately hook the decision maker's interest by saying, we may need to change the existing policy, right? So that's kind of that's their wheelhouse, right? Like they want to know, is there like new legislation, or do we need to modify the regulations? It immediately, ties the issue to kind of what they're responsible for, which is a great way to get them hooked and get them to, pay attention. Because again, these particularly senior decision makers, they've got 1,000 things coming at them every day. You're going to be one meeting of their day out of, dozens. You may have, schedule, you may be scheduled to have half an hour with the decision maker, and then, he or she arrives 10 minutes late, and then 10 minutes into your conversation, something urgent comes up and they have to cut it short. So what you thought was going to be a half-hour meeting with the minister turns into 9 minutes. But yet, if you can convey what the issue is in those first couple of minutes, get their interest hooked, then you've been successful in that first interaction, because then they'll want more information and they'll come back to you for more. And so I would suggest that in building these relationships with the policy world, the last thing you would want to do is lead off with, well, I'm here to ask for more money for research, because, particularly, MPs and ministers at the federal level, they're getting lobbied every day, from lots of people who are always looking for more money for whatever interest they're in, right? So don't lead off with that. Try to put yourselves in the shoes of the decision maker and what they're dealing with and how you might be able to help them, so that you build that rapport and start to develop that relationship. You can always then, in time, raise issues around concerns about, funding levels. But if you lead off with that, it kind of reduces you to, just another lobbyist, just another interest group who's looking for something from the decision maker, rather than the decision maker seeing you as an ally and helping them deal with the issues that they're dealing with. Does that make sense? Okay, so let me pause there and turn it back over to Bryn. I think we have maybe some closing remarks, and then, as I said, I'm happy to stay on for another, few minutes if there are other questions that people want to ask.
So if we want to do more questions right now, we can do that. Just because if anyone has to leave right at 1, but they have a question they want to ask, we can open that up now.
Okay, sure.
And then if not, we can move on to closing remarks.
Okay, so happy to take another question.
If there's any other questions, put them in the chat.
Oh, okay, yeah.
There may have been a few from before as well.
Okay, sorry, can you help me grab one of them and just verbalize it?
Yeah, so there's this one about how working as a scientist often involves moving like large geographical distances to work at certain institutions, but current policies may hinder this, like difficult visa applications, etc. So the question was, what would you suggest in terms of balancing policy changes to support scientists versus moving science to allow people to work from their home countries?
Yeah, so that would be an excellent question for next week's session on policy for science, because that would be, that's a great policy for science question. Basically, how does our science policy support researchers wherever they are? It's less of an issue of science for policy, because nowadays with this kind of technology that we're using right now and all other types of technologies, getting the evidence into the policy world, the evidence can come from basically anywhere geographically, so that's less of a science for policy issue. But yeah, I would say hold that thought for next week's workshop and see what Imogen says.
Yeah, and then the other question I saw here was that someone asked they would really like to know more about your role at U of Ottawa and about other spaces where people are moving science policy forward.
Yeah, so my just quickly, I'll say that as of last October, I am now an executive in residence at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy, which is one of the few sort of centers or institutes in Canadian academia that really focuses on the science policy interface. But they're growing. Like, there's an increasing number of these. 20 years ago there wasn't much at all, and now we're seeing more and more of these types of institutes or centers crop up across the country, as well as things like the Toronto Science Policy Network. There's also at Ottawa. There's one in Montreal, and so these student groups are also proliferating, which is great. It's a wonderful, healthy sign, I think, that students in the sciences are increasingly interested in science policy and that interface. So happy to talk more about that. Maybe can connect offline, but maybe we'll go to one more question.
Yeah, I didn't see anything else in the chat. So if anyone else has a burning question, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat. And otherwise we can move on to the closing.
Well, maybe I could just close with one final thought. I do think that this type of session is really helpful, and I'm really pleased to see that there's increasing interest in the science policy interface. And again, happy to follow up offline with anyone who wants to contact me. I think the more we think about how do we bring science and policy together, better off we're going to be able to deal with these major societal challenges that we're dealing with. So kudos to the TSPN team for bringing you this session. Thank you.
All right, so we're just gonna close out real quick here. So yeah, thank you so much, Jeff, for joining us today and sharing your experience. It's been really valuable. So just going to talk to everyone about our workshop next week. So yeah, if this workshop interested you and you're also interested about learning about the other side of this science policy issue, I encourage you to attend the second workshop in the series, which will focus on how policy governs the way that science is done. We will have expert guest Dr. Imogen Ko joining us. She's a professor in the Department of Chemistry and Biology at Toronto Metropolitan University and is a leader in the advancement of equity, diversity, and inclusion principles in the way that we conduct science. And also, if you attend both of the workshops and complete a short survey for us afterwards, you'll be entered in a draw to win one of 4 $25 Tim Hortons gift cards. And then we're also excited to get together for an in-person event in 2 weeks, location to be determined at or near U of T campus. We hope you'll join us and socialize with current, former, and future TSPN members in a casual, friendly environment. We especially encourage you to come out to the social if you have any interest in joining the TSPN exec next year. The nominations period for positions on the executive team will be opening in late July. There are positions for varying levels of time commitment, and any U of T student who attends 2 or more TSPN events or meetings in the 2022-23 academic year is eligible to submit a form. There are still events coming up soon, such as the social and the annual general meeting in the first week of August. So it's not too late if you're interested in joining next year. And we'll be doing a lot of these activities that Jeff has mentioned are a great starting point for scientists interested in getting involved in policy. So writing op-eds, for example, organizing events such as this one, public panels, and some science advocacy work. So if you're interested in learning more about us, volunteering for future events, or joining the executive team, we encourage you to join our Slack, which is probably the best way to stay up to date about upcoming events and volunteering opportunities. You can join our Slack through this link, which is also posted at tspn.ca. And we also encourage you to join our mailing list, a link for which is also available at tspn.ca. And if you have any questions about science policy or how you can be involved in TSPN, and don't hesitate to reach out to anyone on the executive team via the TSPN Slack. So with that, I'll thank everyone for participating today. I hope to see many of you in the coming weeks at our second workshop and our social event. So we'll say goodbye for now and have a great Thursday afternoon. Actually, I think I don't have the end meeting hours.
Thank you all for coming. Thanks, Dr. Kinder.
Thank
We'll
you,
end it there. Bye.